Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture in this unit on the new nation, right? And so the first lecture talked about and focused on President Washington and President Adams, right? The first two presidents of the United States, and then Washington, strived for neutrality, but he was a supporter of kind of the Federalist ideas for the most part. And Adams was a Federalist, right? He was one of the leaders of that faction or that political party. After President Adams, who only serves for one term, right? He does not get reelected. He's voted out of office. Is President Jefferson, right? And so this is the election of 1800, and for a lot of reasons, it's kind of known as almost like the Second American Revolution in a way, right? Uh, Sorry, wait for the bell to finish there. So it's actually it's a really important moment in history, right? Because it's the first time that we have a different political party coming to power, right? So whereas the Federalists were in charge, in 1800, now the Democratic Republicans are in charge. And what's so important about this and why it's considered a revolution, so to speak, is because the transfer of power happened peacefully, right? There was no rebellion, there's no revolution, there was no fighting between the two different parties. Both parties accepted the election, and they moved on from there, right? And so that really sets an important precedent in American history that has been followed up to this day, right? That every election, there really has not been, there might be small pockets of violence like there are everywhere, but there's not this mass movement to kind of resist the election, right? And that's really important. And that starts here in the election of 1800. The development of the political two-party system leads to the passage of the 12th Amendment around this time, and that's when now instead of casting ballots for your preferred candidate, right, for president, and then the second place candidate would become vice president, what they do now is everyone casts separate ballots for president and vice president. That way you don't have this runner-up of election who's most likely going to be of this other party serving as vice president to the president. Now you have typically going to have two people of the same political party as president and vice president. And so Thomas Jefferson becomes this president, right? He seeks to kind of decrease the role of the central government, of the federal government in society, right? He emphasizes more states' rights. But in principle, that's kind of what he thinks in theory, but in action, he ends up being more moderate. He ends up being more related to the Federalists than he might want to admit. And one important example of this is the Louisiana Purchase. So in 1803, France under Emperor Napoleon decides to give up their American holdings, right? To give up the Midwestern section of the United States, and Jefferson agrees and with delegates who went to France, agree to purchase this territory, the Louisiana territory, and Congress ratifies it. The Senate ratifies this treaty, right? So allowing him to purchase Louisiana territory and double the size of the United States, right? So the United States territory doubles. That's pretty significant, right? After 1803. Why this is kind of ironic is because there's no power in the Constitution that spells out the president's right or authority to buy land like this. There's nothing in the Constitution written. And as Democratic Republican, right, who was supposed to be a strict interpreter of the Constitution, kind of steps outside of his theory and becomes a little more practical, right? He realizes there's major benefits to owning this land, economic benefits, political benefits. Right now, there's no longer an enemy or a rival, I should say, country on the border, right? So it was a smart move, but it does kind of go against his idea of limiting the power of the federal government. And this continues to hasten the American migration west, right? So a common theme throughout much of the United States history, arguably even to today, is that people move west, right? Even today, states like Arizona and New Mexico, their populations are growing, right? So people move out west because there's more land, there's more opportunity, right? Land is cheap because there's so much of it, and so it allows a lot of people to have their own, become property owners, right? Which is really important. So this map here kind of just gives you a sense of just how large this land was. The most important city at this point was New Orleans, right? And then everything, all the land that kind of fed into the Mississippi River here, which you can see right here, is part of that Louisiana Purchase, right? So modern day states like Louisiana, Arkansas, Iowa, the North and South Dakotas, Minnesota, Kansas, and Nebraska, right? These states all are part of what all these states are a part of the land that was Louisiana Purchase, right? This map is also just showing us the journey of Lewis and Clark, that famous expedition, right? They departed from St. Louis. They traveled through much of this territory that was unknown to Americans, right? Using Native American guides like Sacagawea, a woman, right, who helped them. They eventually make it all the way to the Atlantic coast in modern-day Washington State, I believe, Washington State, right? And so it's a pretty important thing that they bring back a lot of information. They help map out the area, which is really important for the federal government to kind of understand what to do with this new land they have. Another important event that happens under Jefferson's presidency is the judicial case of Marbury v. Madison. All right, and so at this point we have Federalist and Democratic Republicans, right? And as Adams is leaving office, he tries to nominate as many judges as possible to the courts, right, and as many Federalist judges as possible, right? So Federalist judges would believe in a stronger government. They would support efforts to make a stronger centralized government. And that was his goal, his idea of essentially trying to pack the courts, right? This is the same argument that's being used against the Republicans today, right, during the most recent nomination process of Amy Coney Barrett, right, that they're trying to push through these nominations before an election, right, so or before a new administration possibly takes office. And so there's controversy around it then and now. So these judges were called midnight judges because they essentially became judges on one of the last days of Adams' presidency. And one of these men was a man named William Marbury, right? But he never received his official papers when Adams was president. And so when Jefferson was president, he went to the Secretary of State, who was James Madison, who will become president after Jefferson, to get his papers to become an official judge. Madison refuses to hand these over, right? So in order to get his papers, right, he sues, and they go to the Supreme Court. Because according to Marbury, the Judiciary Act of 1789, the law, right, said that Madison had to give him these papers. The Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time was a man named John Marshall, right, who was actually a Federalist. He believed in a strong central federal government, but he ruled against his own party here, right? He ruled against his party. Marbury did not receive his appointment, and he ruled, in fact, that the act itself, the Judiciary Act of 1789, was unconstitutional, right? So yes, the law said he was supposed to give him this paper, but Marshall argued the Constitution gave no right to the Supreme Court to actually do this, right? So the law had overstepped its bounds. And so because of this, this is a really important case, one of the most important cases in the history of the Supreme Court, because it establishes something called judicial review, right? So the Supreme Court gives itself this power, right? And this power is that the Supreme Court has the right to declare acts of Congress or the president unconstitutional. Right, and so this has been used throughout history to kind of overturn certain things, both state and national laws that were deemed unconstitutional. Right, and sets what we call a precedent. And this, if you guys pay attention at all to the nomination process, right, of Amy Coney Barrett, they talked about the idea of super precedent. Right, there's certain laws, very few. I think they named only 6 that no one can in their right mind would actually think to overturn. And this is one of those precedents, something that no one will even attempt to logically or reasonably overturn. This idea that the Supreme Court does have the right to rule things unconstitutional. And that's what gives the Supreme Court power, what gives it authority. So it's a really important case, and we should definitely know this one. Right, and this goes to a debate that is constantly happening in American history. And again, if you're paying attention to the recent nomination process, you're going to hear these words thrown around a lot, right? Originalism versus the Constitution as a living document. So originalism is the theory behind interpreting the Constitution as a law, right? It's written as a law, so it should be followed like a law, and understanding it, interpreting it as the writers who wrote it understood it, right? So that it had a particular meaning when it was written, and it can't really change over time unless it's amended by, the proper process. Other judges believe that it should be treated more as a living document, right? That yes, it has some original meaning, we should keep that, but it was also specifically designed, they argue, by the founders to be kind of open-ended, to be a little ambiguous, right? And that would allow things to change with the circumstances of the time, right? So that it can change as things change because it has enough open-endedness for that to happen, right? And the judicial review then gets caught in the middle, right? How do you rule something constitutional or unconstitutional? If things can change, right, then maybe it's a lot harder to make something unconstitutional because, well, what if you interpret it this way or that way? If you stick to the idea that it's original, right, and how the founders thought of it, then things can be, more things can possibly be ruled unconstitutional. And so this is a debate that we still have, and if you pay attention or rewatch some clips from the current nomination process, you're going to see a lot of this debate of originalism going back and forth. All right. So moving into now to the presidency of James Madison, kind of the hallmark of his presidency for us is the War of 1812. So Jefferson serves for 2 terms he serves for 2 terms, and then James Madison takes control after that. And so, as we might know from the French Revolution, right, there's the terror and revolutionaries in France, and they declared war with England. So then, in return, England blockades French ports, so they don't let ships in or out of French ports. Uh, and because of this, the English end up capturing American ships trying to trade with France, right, and impressing these American soldiers, right. And impressing them means impressment is this idea of forcing foreigners, like American soldiers in the British example, to serve in their navy, right. So they were forcing Americans against their will to serve in the English Navy, and they were disrupting American trade. On top of that, they eventually find out the American government finds out that the British are the ones supplying Native American tribes in the Indiana Territory, the Mantecumseh that we talked about last lecture, with weapons, right? So this Native American warfare and the American warfare happening in the new territory is being supported by the British, right? And so this makes Americans very angry at the British, makes James Madison very angry at the British as well, right? And so eventually, after these things build up for a certain amount of time, James Madison is elected, right? And in 1812, he declares war. At first, the British are taking the upper hand. The Americans try to invade the Canadian territory, the city of Montreal, and it was a miserable failure. British troops land all along the coast of America, and they burn down villages and towns. Most famously, they burned down Washington, D.C. There's a famous story that James Madison's wife, Dolly Madison, fled the White House as it was burning, but managed to save the original portrait of George Washington. So it's kind of a cool side note there. So things aren't looking great, but eventually Americans do win some surprise naval victories with ships like the USS Constitution, which actually still exists today. It's one of the first iron-side ships, so it was a wooden ship with iron on the side of it to help protect against cannon fire. And if you go to Boston, you can actually see the USS Constitution. It's over 200 years old, right? Pretty cool. Another famous battle is the Battle of Baltimore. The British try to invade Baltimore. They bombard and lay siege to Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. The Americans managed to defend and repel the British. And this is a really famous battle because it helped that, right? It increased nationalism and pride in the United States. But also, it's Francis Scott Key, the writer of the Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem, witnessed this battle, and he wrote this poem, the Star Spangled Banner, as the battle was happening, right? And that's where we get our national anthem from, right? So it's a source of national unity, this war, at the end of it, right? Even though you can't really say the Americans won it necessarily, it was more like a tie, but this idea of increased nationalism, increased pride is really important for the American experiment. General Andrew Jackson, right? That name will come back to us because he eventually becomes president. Wins a major battle, the Battle of New Orleans in 1814, like handily defeats the British. Ironically enough, though, this battle happens after the peace treaty to end the war is signed. But since it takes so long for things to get information to travel, at this time they didn't know the war was over when they were fighting this battle. So it was an unnecessary battle in some senses, but in other ways it really solidifies that Americans were a country to kind of be respected, and that the British kind of recognized that at this point. Right, so here this map kind of just showing you some of these battles again, right? There was battles up in upstate New York, Lake Champlain. The U.S. actually wins that battle, which is important. Battle of Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and New Orleans, right? Some of these major highlights, kind of a widespread conflict throughout all of the American territory, right? Because keep in mind, at this time, the British still control Canada, so they're all right there, right? And if you remember from last lecture, there was a lot of places that the British never left, right? The forts they occupied, they didn't leave. And so there was some, presence of the British troops there. So really importantly here, the causes and effects of this war. The causes of the British impressment of American sailors, forcing them to work for the British Navy, international conflicts over commerce and trade, and British aid to Native Americans. The result is that Britain and France gain some more respect for the United States. Really important that national pride in the United States grows, which is important. And while the war is going on, this limited trade, the U.S. manufacturing then increases. Right, you can't buy things abroad, so you have to make it here. And the Native American resistance also begins to decline because they've lost. The British stop supporting them as much, and so these are very important consequences. Even though you can't necessarily say the Americans won the war, in hindsight they do, right? Because of these benefits they receive. right? And I want to end with just showing you this last map of North America, of the modern day United States, right? Just kind of get you an idea of how things are evolving over time, right? So by the time the war is over, towards the end of Madison's presidency, right, in the year, I believe this map was from 1816, 1817, so it's a couple of years after the War of 1812 ends. This is what we have as a country, right? So we have grown from the 13 original states, which can be seen here, right? New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. And now we can see there's more states, right? The Union has grown. The states of Vermont, Maine, and Kentucky, right, and Tennessee are some of the first states to join. Then we eventually have Ohio and Indiana by this point, and Louisiana, right? We still do not control Florida. The Spanish are still in control of the western part of the United States, the modern-day United States. So modern-day states like New Mexico, Arizona, California, Texas, right there, part of Spain. But here, this is Louisiana Purchase territory, right? So now it's known as, once it becomes part of the United States, it's known as the Missouri Territory. One of the states will become Missouri. We also have the Illinois Territory, so Illinois is close to becoming a state. Michigan, right? There is still some disputed territory on the northern border with England and with Spain here, right? But the United States is growing, and there are more states. This means there's more senators and more representatives in the Congress, and this process is going to continue for much of the United States history. This expansion into the 50 states we know today, right? So these challenges that are faced are overcome. Largely, right, in this early part, some are left kind of to simmer and to percolate, like the sectional and nullification issue. But most of these early challenges are faced pretty successfully by the American government.